Welcome to Who Runs This Park, a podcast where you are invited into the hearts and stories of those who have committed their careers to the protection and preservation of our great national parks. Who Runs This Park aims to be a catalyst for inspiration, highlighting all that goes into managing our national parks and building a sense of appreciation for the invaluable beauty, diversity, and history of our protected lands. Life is too short to eat boring granola. Granarly, the world's one and only whiskey granola, fills that void. When I was a student at the University of Texas, I worked with Granarly, a granola company based in Austin, falling in love with both the granola and the mission. Go to granarly.com with code WRTP15 to get 15% off to fuel your next adventure. See show notes for more details. Today, we have Sue Fritzke with us, the Capitol Reef National Park Superintendent. Capitol Reef, located in south central Utah, is known as a hidden treasure filled with cliffs, canyons, and bridges in the Water Pocket Fold, a geologic monocline extending almost 100 miles. Sue has been superintendent at Capitol Reef since 2018, after serving different roles across a plethora of California national and state parks, and has introduced amazing partnerships with various organizations. Today, we have the privilege of learning Sue's story and getting a glimpse into her heart for our national parks. Sue, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm excited.
Yeah, let's jump in. I guess stepping back, I'd love to kind of hear about what your experience as a child was like in nature. Has this always been a love of yours? Is it something you grew into?
My family moved to California when I was about 6 months old, and they decided to start sleuthing around and learning California and learning, sort of what the resources were there. And so we started doing hiking when I was very little in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then eventually they discovered Yosemite National Park. And so that was pretty much where we spent most of our summer vacations. When my dad had
Cool.
vacation time, we would go up to Yosemite, and really developed a love for just hiking around in the back areas behind our house in the Bay Area, and then in the mountains in the Sierra Nevada.
That's awesome. Was hiking kind of what you spent your most time doing? Did you do some camping, or did you enter into backpacking, stuff like that?
So yeah, we did a lot of camping and then hiking, which I actually hated. I hated hiking when I was a little kid because I was the youngest child in my family,
Yeah.
and I was the only girl, and so my legs were shorter. I was smaller, and it was really kind of depressing because I was always the person leading up the rear of the family, and that was kind of I really just detested that. And so I never thought that I would get into hiking and all those kinds of things. And but then later on in life, as I got more active with Girl Scouts, was very active with Girl Scouts all the way through high school,
Oh, cool.
and really started to realize that all of those things that I had learned hiking with my family and spending time in these wonderful outdoor areas gave me knowledge about what the plants were, what the rocks were, how the water worked, all those different kinds of things, and I was able to share that with other people, and so it just made the hiking less detestable.
Yeah. You find other things to appreciate, and then maybe that reduces the pain of trying to catch up to
Exactly.
the rest of your family.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So then I guess, well, one, growing up in the Bay Area, it's a beautiful part of the country, and can really be like such a good learning ground. And also probably anywhere within the U.S. can be such a good learning ground. But that's really special. I guess, what led to your decision to then study environmental studies and physical geography at BC is what, or UCSB is what I found
Right.
via, the internet.
Yeah. So I actually decided when I was about 8 years old that I wanted to be a park ranger. So kind of early.
Wow. Even amidst not liking hiking?
Well, yeah, it had to do with the interactions that my family had with the park rangers in Yosemite, and we would go on these backcountry trips into newly established wilderness in Yosemite National Park, and there was one ranger in particular that I just was enthralled with. His name was Carl Sharsmith, um, Dr. Carl Sharsmith. He was actually a botany professor at San Jose State University. But he, in the summers, spent his summers educating people about plants and nature and things like that. And so he would come out and just to hang out with the kids. We'd get down on the ground in these high alpine areas and look at these little plants that were like a quarter of an inch high, and he would explain all of these things in nature that we were seeing. And I thought, that is what I'm going to do when I grow up.
That's really cool.
Yeah, so when I went to UC Santa Barbara, I sort of was on that trajectory-ish, um, but I really wanted to study biology, and I didn't do so well grade-wise, and so I started going into environmental studies,
Nice.
physical geography, and just started to add on classes. So I started
Okay.
adding on botany and started adding on geology and wildlife management and all these different things that have led to my success in the National Park Service.
Nice.
I think at that point I had kind of forgotten that that's sort of what I wanted to do
Right.
was work for the Park Service, but I was just studying. So
Yeah.
it's cool.
So I guess I have an idea or a sense of maybe what environmental studies contains, but I guess what is physical geography? What does that entail?
Yeah, so there's two kinds of geography. There's social geography, which is sort of maps, like what city lies in what area of
Oh,
the country.
interesting.
Physical geography is really understanding the interrelationship of different physical dynamics. So how water changes, how rocks appear, how water interacts with plants, how plants interact with soils and
Okay.
geology. And so it's understanding all these other sciences and how they integrate with each other, which is sort of what the Park Service does, as it
Cool.
turns out. So
Yeah.
it's really nice.
Yeah, it's fun when what you study actually leads into what you do work-wise. That doesn't always happen. So it's nice when
Right.
that goes towards that. And I guess,
Yeah.
did you go to UCSB? And again, I'm not from California, so I have to practice my different acronyms. Were they specifically known for their environmental studies, physical geography programs?
Yeah, they were. That program really started in the 1960s, and by the time I got there in the 80s, it was a well-established program, and really leading to people going into basically different kinds of environmental careers.
Really cool. That's awesome. And kind of taking a step back to, um, so I missed the name of the park ranger at Yosemite. Did you say
Carl
Carl?
Sharsmith.
Okay, so was Carl? I'm assuming he was a park ranger.
Yes.
And did you see him consecutive summers, or was
Mhm.
it kind of oh, that's really special?
Yeah, yeah. It was really neat. We would run into him. It seemed like every year he made an effort to join up with my family. My family led Sierra Club trips,
Oh, cool.
and so he would make sure that he joined up with that group and then interacted with us for a day or two.
Okay.
And then he would just go traipsing off into the mountains. And I thought, wow, that is a cool job.
Yeah, you're like,
Yeah,
I'm intrigued by that.
yeah.
Very cool. So while you're at UCSB, you said you kind of got caught up in your studies, which, a very good studious student of you to do so. As you were starting to, look towards graduation, did those ideas and dreams for becoming a park ranger come back, or what did kind of that transition to the working world look like?
I completely panicked and had no plan whatsoever, so I joined the Peace Corps.
Oh,
And
nice.
and that is absolutely what happened to me. I realized I'm graduating. I don't have a job. I don't know how to move to that next step. And so I think I'll delay it by joining the Peace Corps. And I did that for 2.5 years.
Cool. Where were you? I don't know if stationed is the correct term.
It is. I was assigned to a location in the Andes of Ecuador in South America. As it turned out, while I was in training, I was supposed to be a forestry volunteer, and I was supposed to be planting non-native trees for production of firewood. And I had
Cool.
a problem with the idea of planting non-native trees in the Andes. And at the same time, I was very fortunate because a representative of the Ecuadorian National Park Service came into the Peace Corps office and said, "Hey, we would like to develop a future collaboration between the Ecuadorian National Park Service and the Peace Corps, and talk about future having volunteers um, working in some of our national parks." And my program manager said, "I think I have the right person for you right now."
That's pretty cool. Yeah, your spidey sense kind of is like, oh,
Yep.
wait, I remember.
Yep.
Okay, well, I guess we'll jump back into the Peace Corps stuff. A quick tidbit is my uncle did the Peace Corps a while back. So I have very, very, very limited exposure to what it is. And that's essentially the extent. So it sounds like the Ecuadorian government, or I guess more so the Ecuadorian National Park, wanted to do a partnership with the Peace Corps, and your program director kind of had seen something in you and actually recommended you forward.
Yes. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. And I got assigned to an ecological reserve that goes from 10,000 to 17,000 feet in elevation, at least the area that I worked in.
Wow.
So it was way high in the Andes. And then my job was to basically identify everything that was inside
Wow.
that reserve. Literally, this had been an area on a map of Ecuador that the World Wildlife Fund had come in and basically drawn circles and said, these are areas that you Ecuadorian government should preserve because they are very unique biologically and geologically. And but they didn't really know what was inside of them. And if they
Okay.
didn't know what was inside of them, then they didn't know how to manage them. So
That's really cool.
yeah.
Yeah, I spent some time in Peru, and I remember what was so crazy about it. And I'm curious if this kind of equivalates to part of your experience, but a 15,000-foot mountain in Colorado is going to be tree line, like, no trees, covered in snow all year round. And there it's like a rainforest almost, or,
Right.
I don't know
Right.
the proper microclimate, but I thought I was amazed by that.
Yeah. Yeah. We had cloud forests that went up to about 12, 13,000 feet.
It's really cool.
And yeah, it was amazing.
So did that kind of fall into your time in the Peace Corps? Or did that actually extend past your stint there?
I did that the whole time I was there. And then the last month or two, I actually extended so that I
Okay.
could then work in other high elevation parks in the country. It's interesting. Ecuador is right on the equator. That's the name of the country. And most people, when they go to Ecuador, they like to concentrate on the biological diversity of the tropical rainforests.
Okay.
And so at that time, the last person who had actually done any kind of real specific natural history studies prior to my arrival in that particular part of the country was Alexander von Humboldt 150 years before I got there.
Wow.
So it was just interesting because there was so much that was there that he had discovered. And then 150 years later, I'm following up with, well, this is what it looks like now.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Did you feel like you were learning via like fire hose of just kind of trying to figure out how to identify different species and
Yeah, I mean, I'm fresh out of college, had taken all these botany classes, had a minor in botany, really thought I was really good at everything. And then I get there and it's like, These are plant families I haven't even ever heard of, much less, I don't even know what's in
Yeah.
them. Seeing trees at 14,000, 15,000 feet that have flowers that look like daisies. I mean, it was weird
Yeah.
because it just took even the plant families that I knew and that I was familiar with, it showed me um, the diversity of those plant families, and I was thinking everything fit into these nice, neat little boxes, and it doesn't.
Yeah. Per per life continues to show you that that's usually not the
Yeah,
case.
yeah,
So were botany classes learning different? Is it like biology, but make it about plants
plant.
and stuff?
Yeah,
Okay, cool.
yeah,
So
yeah.
then when I was doing some research in preparation for our conversation, a couple articles mentioned that you used to teach gardening classes at, I think, a
Right.
local university. So is this where this love and knowledge started, or was it maybe more confirming and you already had that interest when you were in school?
My mom was a real fanatic amateur botanist and gardener. And so I think I just picked up a lot of that interest from her.
Yeah,
We would always hike along and then she would, point out something and then we would sort of look at why is this plant different from this other one and, what are its unique characteristics. And
right.
so it was always sort of investigating this stuff.
Yeah,
And
just kind of
yeah,
exploring with a
so, yeah,
curiosity. So, obviously you're working for the National Park Service right now. So at some
yeah,
point you moved back to the US.
I did.
What was that transition like? Was it a similar, like, oh, my time's up? Maybe I should just go back?
I was kind of done with being in South America. I was sort of a lot of things that are just really always a struggle in
Yeah,
terms of you're in a different culture.
yeah.
My hair, which is still long, but it actually turned blonde while I was there.
Really?
And because I was high elevation and then taking some medicines that just sort of bleach your hair out. And being blonde and 5'6" in a country where most men are 5'6" was not good in my
Yeah,
20s. And it just led to a lot of really uncomfortable situations. So
yeah,
I really was just kind of ready to come back to the US.
yeah,
When I came back, though, it was very hard because you're coming back after 2.5 years of experience in another country, becoming fluent in a different language and culture. And, people would say, oh, you were in the Peace Corps. How was that? And you had to sort of decide, do I give them the 1 minute version, the 5 minute version, or the 10-minute version? Because
yeah,
that's about all anybody would give you. And their response to that was usually something like that. Oh, well, we just bought a new car,
yeah. Like,
and I'm
cool.
thinking, so it was really difficult,
Yeah,
even learning how to speak the language again, how to speak English again,
catching up
because
with
I
the
was.
new terms, 2.5 years.
Right, right. One of the really scary things, we've had these connection issues trying to get this interview set up, was computers. When I left for the Peace Corps,
Wow.
computers were mainframe computers with punch cards. When I came back, it was the very initial beginnings of personal computers. So it was really hard.
Yeah, that's really disorienting. And also, you've spent the past like 2.5 years also, it sounds like, kind of in the mountains exploring and then
Yeah,
adjusting back, maybe what
yeah.
you were used to before. Yeah, I imagine that was a hard transition. After coming back to the US, did you go straight into the National Park Service or?
I didn't have a job when I came back, and I was sort of trying to figure out, okay, what are my next steps? I obviously need to get a job. My parents do not want me to live at their house now that they've been empty nesters for 2.5 years. And then I very fortuitously got a letter that was sent to my parents' address that was from UC Santa Barbara celebrating the 30th anniversary of the Environmental Studies program. And so I figured out how to drive a car again.
Yeah.
And I drove
Relearned
down.
English, relearned how to
Yes,
drive.
exactly. Oh, and how to use a bank. Yeah, that was a
Oh, good.
concept.
Yeah.
Um, and so I drove down to UCSB and spent 3 or 4 days there. And there happened to be a person there who'd been in the program a couple of years before me, and she worked for Yosemite National Park. And I didn't run into her. I didn't get to know her or anything, but sort of at the end of this get together of this 30-year celebration of the program, I went into my old career advisor in the environmental studies program and said, I just got back from the Peace Corps and I'm looking at, future opportunities. And he looked at me and he said, did you get to talk to this person that works in Yosemite? Because she's trying to hire somebody right now. Somebody apparently pulled out of the job and she's really kind of desperately trying to fill a gap.
Wow.
And I said, no. And he said, well, let me get you on the phone with her. And I'm thinking, I've just come back from a country where you have to set up a time slot to allow a phone call to the United States a week in advance to
Wow.
get that scheduled.
They
And all
didn't
of a
have
sudden,
FaceTime then.
no. And here he is calling up this person. She gets on the phone and she said, well, hey, do you know Yosemite? And I said, yeah, I spent most of my
Yes.
summers there. And she said, well, let me just ask you a few questions about, if you were working in Yosemite Valley and somebody asked you how to get from here to there or what this trail would be like. Because she wanted to know, did I really know Yosemite
Right.
that well? And so I was able to ask these questions and she said, I'd like you to send in a resume. And so I sent in a resume. They did an interview. Like 3 weeks later, I was hired.
Wow.
So
And
that was
what
it.
role specifically were you hired for?
I was hired as a park ranger GS4 seasonal interpreter
Okay.
working in Yosemite Valley.
Okay. Wow. The timing is really special of that, of just
Oh, it
how
was amazing.
yeah.
It was amazing.
And it's cool that it was like the park that you grew up going to,
Totally.
there's
Yeah.
60 plus parks and it just happened to be Yosemite. So that's really cool. So I guess if you were a seasonal worker, does that mean you like spend the summers there? I imagine that's more so the high season.
Yeah, and I got hired in May of 1985, and then I worked through December, I think, of 1985. So
Okay.
seasonal positions now are much more limited in the time period that
Okay.
you can work, but at that time they could have actually worked me year round if they'd had the money to do it.
Okay. Got it.
So
Yeah. I guess
yeah,
it's kind of dependent on they can staff as many people as like the visitors that they're having and bringing in revenue maybe.
right.
That's cool. So
Yeah.
how, like, I guess, well, going back to that moment, you said when you were 8 years old, you wanted to be a park ranger. When you entered into being a park ranger at Yosemite, was that confirming? Were you kind of thinking forward of like, yes, I want to stay in this? Or was it more just enjoying that time?
I really enjoyed it. There were just amazing experiences that I had, and that whole ability to take information that you have and observations that you're making
Right.
and turn that into something that people can understand. So talking about geology and
Right.
talking about how Half Dome formed and talking about glaciation and talking about all of these really very, very complex scientific concepts and getting them down to the point where an 8-year-old kid can
Yeah.
understand it. Somebody that was like me,
Yeah. Not where you
20
need
years before. Right.
a bachelor's
PhD.
to
Right.
like
Right.
comprehend.
And that was it was really exciting to sort of see that spark that you would get from people where they would just
Yeah.
all of a sudden understand something or walk away going, oh, wow.
Yeah.
And I really loved that. It was fun.
Yeah, that's
And I
awesome.
ended up doing that for 2 years
Okay.
or 2 seasons. And at the end of the second season, I realized a lot of what we did was worked in the visitor center, and a lot of what we did was told people where the bathroom was.
Yeah.
You'll hear that a lot from people that work in that particular field is
Yeah.
that they are answering the same question over and over and over again.
I'm
And
sure I've been one of those people that ask that question.
well, and you always try to remind yourself that for that person, they are asking that question for the first time.
Yeah.
So even if you've heard it 80 times that day, it's really okay because for them, it's the first time.
Yeah.
And you have to always remind yourself of that. But it was frustrating because there
Yeah.
were things that I felt like I really wanted to help people understand in terms of what they were seeing. And so much of the time that I was spending was explaining, where's the bathroom? Where do I get food? Is there any camping spaces available? All of these things that people should have known, but they didn't. And I realized that even though at 8 years old, this is what I thought I wanted to do, I didn't.
Yeah.
And that was hard.
Yeah, especially, I mean, candidly, I don't remember what I wanted to be at 8 years old. So I can't even kind of think of like, I think I was like, I want to be an astronaut, or I want to be, like maybe what other 8-year-olds were saying. But yeah, it's probably a moment of also maturity of like, okay, like, cool. Just because I wanted to be this doesn't mean I got to experience this. And now I can kind of think what's next.
Yeah. And that's how I ended up deciding to go into grad school.
Okay, cool. That was my next question. Nice pivot.
Nice segue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had wanted to go to Oregon State University with my undergraduate, but it was out of state and I couldn't afford out of state tuition. I applied to Oregon State and again went back into physical geography program and really just sort of wanted to hone my skills and get more into the science of things and really sort of understanding that interrelationship of all these different biological and physical features and how they work with each other on a landscape. Yeah, well, that was I'm really glad I did that.
How long was that program?
I ended up taking the 7-year plan.
Love that.
Partly because I got married, then I got divorced. Let's see, I broke my back in the middle of all of that.
Some life things happened.
Yeah, life happens, And so, what would have been maybe a 2 to 3 year program ended up taking me 7 years to actually finish up.
Hey, but you did it.
I did.
And did you, again, was it you had originally wanted to go to Oregon State because of kind of the name brand it had within the environmental science, physical geography realm?
Mm-hmm.
So again, were you, you're getting to that graduation point. Are you thinking you want to go back into the National Park Service or?
Well, so what was happening is that every year I would go to Oregon State, I would take classes for 6 months of the year.
Okay.
The other 6 months of the year, I worked for the Park Service.
Nice.
As a seasonal. And so
at Yosemite or?
And so I went and I worked up in Mount Rainier first summer. That is where I did my master's research was up at Mount Rainier. So Mount Rainier hired me as a seasonal within the resources management division. Okay. And I did some evaluations of visitor impacts on soils and vegetation in subalpine and alpine areas of one particular area of that park. And sort of helped the park reprioritize what it was doing in terms of overall restoration work that they were doing.
I mean, that's something and we might get into this in a bit, but I think as I've heard in general and just kind of seen is that parks are seeing an increase in visitors, which I think is a beautiful and wonderful thing, but it then does kind of present this paradox of how do you preserve, restore, but then enable people to see. And then, there's Half Dome has the permit, I guess it has for a while, kind of these different systems to try and manage that, but then also like have them stay true to their nature of making them available to the public.
Yeah.
So cool that you got that exposure, it sounds like relatively early on, of kind of evaluating the human factor on geography. So I guess you did Mount Rainier. Did you do any other national parks?
Yeah, and then I came back to Yosemite and went into fire management after Mount Rainier, and I went into basically worked in prescribed fire, and I started that in 1988. That was the year of the Yellowstone fires, and so the next year we were under a complete moratorium for doing prescribed fire until the Park Service reevaluated the entire fire program across the country. And so I worked in suppression for a year and flew helicopters all over the place and put fires out. And then the next year went back into prescribed burning and reintroduced fire into giant sequoia groves down in the southern part of the park.
So prescribed fire, to make sure I understand, prescribed fire is essentially when you're intentionally creating a fire to, because I think it's good and natural for forests and stuff to kind of refresh and restart. But then I guess in terms of the 1988 Yosemite fire, was that essentially a prescribed fire that got out of control?
No, the Yellowstone fires were
Oh,
really caused by
Yellowstone.
a
There
whole
we go.
series, drought
Right.
conditions. Those fires, as it turns out, were really part of what that particular ecosystem does. Naturally, they have these big, massive,
Yeah.
what humans call catastrophic fires, but in fact, they're not
Yeah.
for the ecosystem. But it really made people think about how do we do fire management.
Oh, okay. I see.
And luckily, after all of that and after all of that evaluation, it really confirmed the need to continue doing
Right.
prescribed burning. And
Okay. I
prescribed
see.
burning is known as prescribed fire because it is fire that's introduced into a system under a very specific set of prescribed
Right.
parameters. So the temperature's got to be this, the wind has got to be this, the relative humidity's got to be this, the moisture in the fuel has got to be a certain amount, so that human beings can control it
Right.
and can, make it do what we want it to
Yeah.
do to help out an ecosystem.
Okay. Very cool.
And it was really cool because we did reintroduce fire into giant sequoia groves, and giant sequoias are trees that are absolutely dependent on fire,
Interesting.
and they will not regenerate or very rarely regenerate without fire. Fire clears out all of the duff on the forest floor and allows these little tiny seeds that are about a third the size of a piece of oatmeal to hit the mineral soil, and then you see just thousands and millions of seedlings coming up
Wow.
as a result of that. And so we are introducing fire into giant sequoia groves that hadn't seen fire in over 110 years and had no young giant sequoias
Wow.
in those groves. And that was quite a privilege.
So then when you're introducing fire into that, are those giant sequoias like, I guess, I don't know if the right term is like die, but or they sustain the fire?
They have extremely fire resistant bark that's very, very thick that helps protect them from the heat of a fire. And, so you're just sort of putting fire into the system and getting that bare mineral soil reestablished.
Yeah, it's just cool to see. I don't think there's many people who would be like, oh, what a privilege and an honor to kind of be reintroducing those seedlings like that. It just shows kind of the care for that, like it's good to see that and be like, like that's awesome I don't know. It's just cool to see the care for creating a healthy ecosystem within a place and then getting to have that type of impact, the sequoia groves.
Yeah.
So as you're kind of bouncing around these different national parks, how does, like, once you're working within the national parks, is it difficult to switch between them, or is it very common that people do seasonal stints at different locations?
That's pretty common. And then, in a lot of the larger parks, so Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Rocky, etc., there are enough employees that if you have the skill set that you're able to jump from one program to another, you can often do that within the same park.
Oh, I see.
Which is what I really ended up doing. So I went from interpretation to fire, and then I eventually ended up over in resources management.
Okay.
So 3 different programs.
So then was the resource management, I guess, was that at Mount Rainier or was that?
I did that at Mount Rainier, and then I did it longer term in Yosemite.
Okay. And were you doing the resource management at Yosemite while still doing the master's, or was that kind of post master's?
No, that was while I was still finishing up the master's.
I would imagine.
Took a long time.
But you're also getting experience, so it makes sense. I wonder if that's, or I guess, did you see that among a lot of students that they were kind of splitting their time between maybe working seasonally and then coming back?
Yeah, not a lot. I was one of a group of a number of grad students within the program that were older.
Okay.
We were in our 30s. Most of the grad students are in their 20s. They've just come out of their bachelor's degree. They've gone right on to a master's and then on to a PhD.
Right.
And we had practical on the ground knowledge. And so I remember one time one of my professors was talking about this new way of doing monitoring, and he had this whole thing set up, and I looked at him and I said, this is not going to work because this isn't this isn't based in the reality of being in the field.
Yeah.
And I said, this is a very nice controlled experiment, and that's lovely, but you know what? This has no applicability in the
Yeah.
field. And he kind of looked at me like I had the
How
effrontery
dare
to
you?
actually say something like that to him. But it's like, dude, I've been in the field.
Yeah.
I've been doing studies. I've been doing research, and I know what works, and I also know what
Yeah.
doesn't. And you had to say it with a little finesse, so
Right, of course.
they didn't, kick you out of
Right,
course.
exactly. You're
So,
like, and with the
yeah.
kindest regards, you are wrong. Thank you so much. So, your big graduation day comes up. Are you at this point pretty set and staying in the National Park Service, or?
Yeah, I was pretty much, in the system. Still seasonal
Okay.
though, and which was a little hard. So I went into resources management in Yosemite. I got involved with ecological restoration and vegetation management
Cool.
programs there, and sort of, worked a number of very long years. Actually, at that time, you could work year round but not be permanent.
Oh, interesting.
And then I finally kind of got to the point of realizing I'm never going to get permanent in Yosemite National
Yeah.
Park. It's just they didn't have the money, they didn't have the ability to do it, and I needed to, if I wanted to make a permanent career in this agency, I needed to move.
Yeah.
And so I applied for a number of positions, and I got a job at Redwood National Park up in Northern California, and basically dealing with invasive species management
Oh,
in the
cool.
redwood ecosystem. And did that for 2 years, and that's how I started my permanent career in the Park Service.
Nice. So invasive species management is, I guess, were you doing a lot of studies to then kind of see what's there, or more predictive, like, oh, this might enter, so we should protect against this?
There was a combination of doing studies to try to figure out what
Right.
actually worked to control species, because sometimes it's easy and sometimes it's really, really hard. And then I would say that my time was split about half between doing those studies and then documenting all of that work, and then actually physically
Oh,
going
wow.
out and actually
Yeah.
removing stuff. And so, taking what's called a weed wrench, which is just this giant piece of metal that has a clamp on the end of it, and
Oh my
pulling out
gosh.
acres of Scotch broom, which is this horrible, horrible, horrible
Right.
plant. Beautiful in
Yeah.
Scotland, doesn't belong in the United States, and was taking over prairies. Prairies support elk and other wildlife. If you have
Oh,
Scotch broom
interesting.
in there, the elk aren't there. So again, it's that
Yeah.
whole trying to restore ecosystems back to a way that works, so that these other species that are
And
dependent
do
on those
you
ecosystems can be there.
partner with, I'm curious how, and this kind of applies to probably most of the national parks, but like, is it like you pull out those invasive species, but then the line of the national park ends and then you don't do work beyond that? Or how do you kind of make sure that rather than just like putting a Band-Aid over it, do you partner with people? Or I'm curious about that.
That really has to be a lot of, I think what national parks have to
Right.
do is try to reach out and
Right.
communicate with your neighbors, whether that's private property owners or other public land management agencies, state parks, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, whoever that might be, to just sort of say,
Yeah.
hey, this is something that we're concerned about. You share the same ecosystem. Those ecosystems, these, redwood forest, redwood trees don't
Right.
just end at one boundary. These things cross boundaries. Nature doesn't pay attention to our political boundaries. And so we really need to be looking at this a lot more holistically than just where the boundary line ends. That was a great experience.
So Indiana Dunes National Park has a partner national park because it's where the like birds migrate to and from. I forget what national park it is, but it's in a different country. And so that part was fascinating too. And again, it's like you said, nature does not abide by our political boundaries. It's a great little tidbit. Yeah. That's fun. So then what was it like kind of continuing within the National Park Service? And as you, like you said, continued your permanent full-time career within the service.
Yeah. So I did 2 years up at Redwood, and that was a great experience, just because it's a very different ecosystem there than other parts of the state of California. And then I got a job as a vegetation ecologist at Yosemite. And so I went back to Yosemite again.
Were you looking to go back to Yosemite?
Not, I mean, kind of, because I really loved it. but I also had a great job and great opportunities at Redwood.
Yeah.
But eventually, decided that would be a good move, and it was a career move. Definitely a pay scale up and
Nice.
more responsibility, and going back to a place that I really loved.
Yeah, that's awesome. And then because I know at some point you ended up back in San Francisco
Mhm.
managing, I think it's 4 different areas. Was that right after Yosemite or?
No, it's way more complicated. So I worked in Yosemite as a vegetation ecologist. Then I was promoted to basically supervise the ecological restoration and vegetation programs in the park. And I worked in that capacity between those two kinds of jobs
Nice.
until 2003. So that would have been like 7 years that I
Okay.
was there. And then I moved to Golden Gate National Recreation Area in San
Okay.
Francisco and took over their vegetation management program. And, it was really very interesting because people sort of looked at me like, you're coming from this big, giant natural park, Yosemite, you've been at Mount Rainier, you've been at Redwood, and then all of a sudden you're going to Golden Gate in the middle of San Francisco, which seemed really weird.
Right.
But Golden Gate's just this amazing juxtaposition of really complex human ecology and natural ecology. Golden Gate National Recreation Area has the third highest number of listed federally endangered or threatened species in the National Park Service. The only two
Wow.
parks that have a higher number are both in Hawaii.
Wow.
And a lot of that has to do with urbanization in the Bay
Right.
Area, that there
Right.
are these little tiny remnant areas that have these just tiny populations of species that used to be much more widespread,
Yeah.
and now they're limited to just little pockets. But it was also a great experience to again be able to apply that. How do you manage systems, natural systems with this human overlay?
Yeah.
And at Golden Gate, the thing that was really intriguing was it was not only natural system with current human overlay, but prehistoric human overlay, very
Mm.
historic. So Spanish era, you know, establishment of populations
Yeah.
that were coming from Europe. And so all these different intricacies of these different layers of
Yeah.
human history sitting on top of these amazing layers of vegetation and geology in the Marin
Yeah.
headlands and throughout Golden Gate that was amazing. Yeah.
You have the incoming Silicon
Yeah.
Valley boom to that area.
Yeah.
So future impact also.
Yeah.
Did you find that your funding, I guess it probably changes park to park, but did you have more resources when you were at Golden Gate, or just because of its proximity to so much like urbanization, or?
It's somewhat, I mean, the budget for each park is sort of this mystery and how those budgets get established and how they get maintained.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I've been with the Park Service 38 years and I still don't quite get it and I still fight it
Yeah.
sometimes. But I think also in the Bay Area, there's a lot more, there were, much higher population size, much
Yeah.
more ability to have philanthropic organizations and partner organizations getting money that they donated to the park so that the park could do the work that it needed to do. And that was wonderful.
So then how long were you in that position?
I was in that position for 8 years, and then I moved on from there to the East San Francisco Bay Area. And
Nice.
this was a real jump for me because I go
Okay.
from being a resources manager, basically,
Right.
and then I became a deputy superintendent. And I became a
Okay.
deputy superintendent in 4 national parks or national park sites that
Right.
are history.
Okay. What does deputy mean?
Deputy superintendent means there's a superintendent, and then I'm the person that works directly for that person.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And in most parks that have a superintendent and a deputy, the superintendent deals with all the political stuff and all of
Right.
the stuff that goes on outside the park. The deputy deals with all of the internal operations. In my case, the superintendent knew what my skill set was. We'd known each other for years. And he said, tell you what, we're basically going to just work together as a team to
Awesome.
make these 4 parks function. Each of the parks
Right.
was about 20 to 30 miles separated from each other. They were in different communities. They had different partners. They had very, very different demographics in terms of the populations living around them. And so extremely complex job that not one person could actually do well. And so I had the privilege of being able to learn how to do all of that.
Candidly, that's my heart with this podcast, is like highlighting all these complexities in a way just to like, again, increase appreciation of like, this is all that goes in to maintain and sustain the national parks for future generations, for, like keep them healthy, sustained, all of that. So it's cool to learn more about all those intricate moments.
Yeah. Well, and just it was really an honor also, I think, in all of those parks to understand what that history was. And that's something I think I've learned in the National Park Service, and then just traveling around the country of, discovering, hey, that's a national park site. We should go there. There might be something interesting there, and thinking, I'm going to walk into this place. It's not going to be interesting at all. I'll leave in 20 minutes. And then getting sucked into whatever the story is. And that was the same thing with those sites in the East Bay, is you're dealing with Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. Up until 1945, the largest human-caused explosion happened at Port Chicago, led to the loss of human life, led to the identification of the segregation of the military, and led eventually to the desegregation of the military as a direct result of that particular incident at Port Chicago.
Wow.
So who knew?
I didn't.
Rosie the Riveter, World War II Homefront National Historical Park.
Wow.
We were still dealing with Rosies, and there are still Rosies now that worked during World War II that helped with that war effort. And so working with these women who sort of broke through some of that stereotype of what a woman is capable of and what a woman isn't capable of.
Right.
And so being able to have those conversations with these people is just amazing.
That's special to like, you kind of entered this world for the passion of like the physical geography, the botany, all these things. And then you get to like learn these people's stories and the historical aspects of it. I mean, both are so beautiful. I think the natural aspects of a lot of the parks get a lot of attention and highlights. And then, it's really special to also highlight the like human stories behind all of them. So then we are interviewing superintendents. Did you then transition to Capitol Reef, or how did that transition happen?
Yeah, it was kind of interesting. I had been a deputy superintendent. I ended up doing that job for 7 years. And when you're a deputy, you're not the ultimate person in charge. There's always somebody directly above you.
Got to get sign off from someone.
Yeah. And so at some point I thought, I ought to just try this. And so I applied for and got a detail at Bryce Canyon National Park in Utah. And I did that detail for 4 months. And in that 4-month period, I kind of affirmed to myself that, yes, I actually am capable of being a superintendent, because you always have that doubt.
Oh, of course.
In your mind of, am I capable of doing this? Am I going to like it?
Yeah.
Is this going to be what this park needs? And, so that was really my affirmation that, I can actually do this job.
And it was what? So it was a detail? Nice. Is that like you're filling in for someone while they're out?
Correct. So the former superintendent had retired.
Okay.
And they were announcing for a new superintendent. And so they needed somebody to fill the gap.
Okay. That got you to Utah. Is that kind of then what got you the experience and exposure?
Yeah. So I did that. And then I went back to the 4 parks in the East San Francisco Bay Area. And then about a year later, 8 months later, I got the job at Capitol Reef.
Yeah. You had that little like inkling in your chest. You're like, okay, I know I can do this. I know this is what I want to do. And then here we are.
Yeah. And it was interesting because when I was at Bryce, I'd really never spent much time in Utah. And when I was at Bryce, I thought, this is a really fascinating place. There's amazing resources in the state that I know nothing about.
Right.
And I think the thing that was the most intriguing to me, to be honest with you, is that I had spent so much of my lifetime up and down the West Coast of the United States, going to a place where I didn't understand the ecology. I didn't understand the geology. I couldn't just walk out my door and go, oh, I know what everything is here. Was like, it just opened up my opportunity to learn again. And that was.
Yeah, it's very different.
Yeah.
Even from like kind of a novice perspective, you can kind of look at Yosemite versus many of the Utah national parks and be like, yeah, objectively, these are very different ecosystems, environments, probably different animals, all of those things. And how is that stepping into that superintendency role?
Well, one of the things that you were sort of wondering about was, did I always want to be a superintendent? And the answer is absolutely not. That was never my aspiration.
Right.
Never something that I thought that I even wanted to do.
Yeah.
But, as you get more experience, as you see more superintendents and how they do things, and you're always thinking, I like that, but I didn't like that.
Right.
And so coming to Capitol Reef was really interesting to me. The first staff meeting I had, I was like almost shaking because I was so nervous, because all of a sudden you realize you're the person in charge.
Yeah, you're like, oh wait, everyone's listening to me.
Yeah, you are the person that ultimately has the decision, and you can make that decision, and then you have to live with it.
Yeah.
And you can talk to everybody that you want to about it and get all the advice that you want to,
Right.
but ultimately you're the one that has to make it. And that's really kind of frightening.
Yeah, frightening, but then also empowering at the same time you can't be in the meeting like, and I'm going to defer this to so-and-so.
Exactly.
And what, as we wrap up our time and kind of talk a little bit more about Capitol Reef, coming into the park, what was something that, I guess, one, surprised you about the park itself, and then two, about being superintendent? I mean, you had this experience as being a deputy superintendent, so I'm sure you saw a lot that went on, but, being the main decision maker, what was something that surprised you?
I think how much you have to really pay attention to what's going on outside of the park.
Yeah.
But then also having to pay attention to what's going on inside the park.
Right.
It's that whole balance of keeping your staff going, keeping them inspired, making them feel supported,
right,
and at the same time making sure that you're talking to the external partners, to the external political entities, making sure that they may not like what it is that you're doing, or may not like what your agency is mandated to do, but at the same time you're listening to them. And you're acknowledging their concerns, and you're trying to figure out ways to make things work as best they can based on your agency's limitations and restrictions.
You mean you don't have unlimited resources and funds and all these things?
No.
Yeah. I think, and there's what I liked what you said earlier was kind of when you were at Bryce Canyon, coming and seeing this whole, like you said, you'd been like primarily or really exclusively on the West Coast. And so like seeing this whole different ecosystem of partners and just the dynamics that's also something I don't think a lot of people think about with national parks is like, it is the national park, yes, but there's so much connection with different organizations, different nonprofits, state parks, anything, other national parks out in different countries. Like there's so much intricacy with every single park. So it's cool to kind of, like you said, come to Utah and be like, oh, okay, these are kind of like the partners and the resources that we have. And in that, you've had, a good number of years as superintendent at Capitol Reef. Are there partnerships you want to grow in your time there?
Yeah, I think the collaboration that the park has with the adjacent federal land management agencies, so the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management, and collaborating within those three organizations so that we're all working as best we can to sort of take up the gap. So I remember having a conversation with those two entities a few years ago, and I basically said, we're not expanding our campground inside the park. And so if there are expanded camping needs, campgrounds, et cetera, they need to be accounted for outside the park. And so that can be private sector, that can be local gateway communities, that can be the Bureau of Land Management and the Forest Service. And I think that was really the first time that they'd ever heard that very clearly, that we're not doing anything, we're not going to change things, partly because our campground sits in the middle of a historic landscape, and we don't want to destroy any more of the orchards that were taken out to create the 71 sites that are already there.
Yeah. You're like, we
So,
have a lot already.
Yeah, so it was just kind of one of those interesting, seeing that there's a need, but realizing that we, the park, cannot solve that need, and that need needs to be addressed elsewhere. And then sort of having those conversations of, partnering with other groups to try to figure out how to make that actually happen.
Yeah. A lot of problem solving has to go on of like,
Very
okay,
much.
no, but maybe.
Yes.
If
exactly.
X, Y, and Z, and this and that. I guess kind of coming back to that question of what about Capitol Reef specifically surprised you when you became superintendent?
I don't think I really understood how human beings have interacted with this very, very complex geologic area, and how intricate that relationship has been for thousands of years. And I think the thing that I really love about Capitol Reef is I see it as the integration of 19 very distinct geologic layers that tell millions of years of history, overlain by thousands of years of human history of various groups of Native Americans that moved in, moved out, were here seasonally, were here permanently, and then overlay that with the Latter-day Saints pioneers that moved into the area and established the community of Fruta, which is now where the park headquarters is, established orchards and pasture systems.
Like
and
apple orchards?
Apple orchards,
really?
And pears, peaches, and apricots, you name it, we've got it. And they're all there. And so telling that story of the last 150 years of human history that's layered on thousands of layers of, thousands of years of human history that's layered on top of millions of years of geologic history. So that's the thing that I think is just, it's that combination of all of that is just, if you like geology, come here. If you like botany, come here. If you like human history, come here. If you like pioneer history, come here, because it's all here. Just in different ways.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, that's a great way to kind of wrap things up. Again, thank you so much, Sue, for your time. It was a pleasure to hear just like the intricacy and beautifulness of your story and the just different places you've explored and, said yes to and put yourself out there. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much for listening today. Our music was composed by Danielle Bees. If you liked this podcast, rate, review, download, and tell your friends about it. This ensures the stories of our national parks and how they are run are shared. Listen to the other episodes wherever you listen to your podcasts or visit us at whorunsThisPark.com to learn more. I'm Maddie Pellman, and you've been listening to Who Runs This Park.